De Guzman is a professor of extension and specialist in adolescent development in the Department of Child, Youth, and Family Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She is also the current chair of the Department of Textiles, Merchandising, and Fashion Design. She has over 15 years of experience conducting research and developing programs that address well-being and health among underserved populations, particularly among youth and families in rapidly changing contexts. Example of this work includes her research on long-distance parenting among economic migrants and factors affecting quality of life among rural ethnic minorities. She has over 50 publications, including the book Parenting from Afar, The Reconfiguration of Family Across Distance, which was awarded the prestigious Ursula Galen Global Award by the American Psychological Association for its contribution to psychology as an international discipline. Dr. De Guzman is from the Philippines and was a preschool teacher and a college instructor before coming to the US for her graduate studies in developmental psychology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'd like to welcome you all to give her a round of applause, and I'll let you get started.
Well, thank you, everyone. And again, it was such a pleasure visiting with this group last Monday. And like I said there, I don't teach anymore. I mean, I don't teach in the classroom. So it really is a pleasure to be able to lecture. And I'm kidding, to talk to students and other faculty as well. Because much of my work, I haven't been teaching in the classroom, I think, since 2005. So it's been a while. So I'm going to share my screen here. You probably see everything. There you go. And so I thought, when I was thinking of what to talk about today, I thought, I don't want to just talk about one study, because I can always send you a copy of that study. There's no need to listen when you can probably read it in better detail. And so I thought maybe what I'll do is I'll talk about a group of studies and some of the insights that we've drawn from these different things. I'm not going to go into detail about any of these, just give you a bit of kind of overview, highlights that I hope you'll find interesting, and also show you how, at least give you one example of how somebody, or for myself, how I ended up doing the research that I'm doing now, which is a little bit different from the research I did when I was in grad school. So I'm calling it Filipino Migration and the Remaking of Family Life, Insights from 3 Studies. So first of all, like Maria mentioned, my work really is split into 2. I mentioned this on Monday. One is on research and one is on extension. So today I'll talk about my research side. So my work that looks at, I still do the pro-social behavior research, but I'm really interested these days in the topic of migration and its impact on family life and children's socialization. On Monday, somebody asked, why do you choose to study the research that you do? At some point, you'll find they say all research is me search, something that's relevant to you. There has to be something that's interesting to you, especially in psychology, in the social sciences. I think for a lot of us, we do research that we have some sort of connection to in one way or another. And obviously this one, I'm talking about my research on Filipino migration, a little close to home, pretty obvious there. So why research on Filipinos? Why not, some other group? So the Philippines, first of all, as I mentioned last time, it's a somewhat small country, a lot of people, 110, very, very densely populated country, but a very high rate of migration. Right now, we have about 12.5 million people abroad. That's about 10% of the population. It's really, really high. Most of these migrants are between 25 and 44 years of age, so that what they call productive, economically productive, and also childbearing years, right? By some estimates, 1 out of 3 Filipino children in the Philippines have at least one parent living abroad. So think about that, right? If you're in psychology, family studies, therapy, etc., that's a whole lot of kids living with at least one parent away from the house, if not both. So Philippines, this is really affected by this. They say we're at the age of rapid globalization and mobility. And the Philippines is one of these countries that has really been affected by this movement, specifically for families. Lots of family implications for family. This notion of families under one roof. Sometimes we study families, right? Like in developmental psychology, we'll ask a parent to answer a survey about the kid. Well, the parent may be 3,000 miles away from that kid. The caregiver may be a grandmother, and so on, right? So there's a lot of implications for family research, and yet research, for the most part, still depicts families under one roof. The way we study families, the way we depict families. I think I have always thought that there needs to be some sort of acknowledgement of all sorts of families out there, their different configurations. And then lastly, I was also really interested in this topic because currently a lot of research on migration is transnational migration. So Filipinos with parents abroad, etc. But really migration is way, way beyond that. And I'll talk about that a little bit in this talk for one of the studies that I'm talking about. So I'll talk about these three studies. I'm not going to go, well, just the titles here, I guess. One is this Return to Tarong. And then the other one is on the Yayas. They're domestic workers, care workers, etc. And then families living abroad. So they're kind of all different, but again, tied together with this migration and family life. Now, I think that it's really, really important in any research that you do that you really declare or you're aware of the influence, the theoretical, the theories and models that influence the way you think. So for me, this is one of them, or probably the biggest one. I don't necessarily use this, but I know this really colors the way that I see things, what questions I ask, the methods that I choose. And this is the Whiting model for psychocultural research. It's a really old model from the 70s. Unless you specifically study psychology and development, a lot of people don't even recognize this model. So really, really briefly, the Whiting, so John and Beatrice Whiting, they were really the titans of cultural and cross-cultural research back in the day, right? In the 50s, 60s, and so on. So Beatrice Whiting, so they were a husband-wife pair, she was a very big proponent of this notion of unpacking culture. So you'll see a lot of cross-cultural research, US versus Mexico on child rearing, notions about gender, comparing Polish and Filipinos. It's at least cross-cultural, but we treat culture like it's some sort of kind of a black box, right? Like we don't, like what is it? So the Whitings really talked about unpacking culture, but also had this model that at least tried to explain how children or how individuals become cultural beings. We're all cultural beings, right? How we talk, how we think, the rituals that we have, our art, etc. These are all culturally embedded. So this is kind of their model that goes from your environment in history that leads to sort of your they call them maintenance systems, but this is really your context, right? The context in which you're growing up. And it leads to the child's what they call the learning environment, where and how we're socialized. Like, are you spanked or not? Are you rewarded? How do they discipline you? Who is the caregiver? And then it leads to who we are as adults. I just really, when I saw this model, again, I don't know if you've ever experienced this as students, sometimes you encounter something and you just think, wow, this is an amazing model. And this is one of those for me. I was in the Philippines actually as an undergrad. I still remember being in the dusty libraries, stumbling upon the work of the Whitings, and I just thought, this is what I want to study. And I did some research and I found that one of their students, Carolyn Edwards, was actually in the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. She had actually just moved there, and I thought, I'm going to reach out to her. And 20-some years later, here I am. But I just love this work. And it was a very influential group of scholars that came out of this school. Let me see if I can. And actually today, sometimes I'll read up on a theory, and I'll think, this is an amazing theory. It's a great model. And I'll trace those scholars and I'll find out they were all students actually of the Whitings. So some of you might come across some of these models if you study culture, like Barbara Rogoff, Patricia Greenfield, there you go, Maria, Worthman, Tom Weissner, who's out there in California. These were all, I realized when I look at their models, I was like, oh, no wonder I like their models. They were all students of the Whitings. And again, you can see I'm a big fan of their work. I really do love this, the way they talk about culture and how they try to unpack, how they try to explain how we become cultural human beings in a really deep way. One of their students whose work I do follow and I do use their model is a developmental niche framework. So basically what this is, I'm not going to go into detail, but basically they depict child development as, well, first of all, they say the child is an active being, right? They're not just receiving influence, but they're active. And they say there are three important contexts that influence child development and how they become cultural human beings. So one is the physical settings. You know, are you growing up in the Philippines or Poland or California or Nebraska? You know, is it rural Nebraska or the city? I was going to say urban, but urban part of Nebraska. And then the customs, like how is it that the children are raised there? Are they spanked? Or do they go to school? Are they all homeschooled? Is there formal schooling? And then who are the caretakers and their psychology? You know, what are the caretakers' beliefs and practices? So what I find interesting in this theory is this, right? So they say that in general, in a stable environment, these three things actually are in balance, right? So if let's just say the customs, right? If in your entire neighborhood, spanking is common, children are spanked. And then the caregivers are also doing the spanking, right? If you do something, they do the spanking, and they believe in spanking. Well, you know, it's almost like there's no tension there. But what happens when one changes? What if you are from a society where they believe in spanking? They believe in using ghosts, as a disciplinary technique. But you land in, let's say, California, where in a place, for example, where spanking is frowned upon, where the explanation for illness is not ghosts, but, you know, physiology, and you go to a doctor. So there's that disconnect. So what happens then when there is that disconnect and there's no balance? So anyway, so that's kind of what I find really interesting. And that kind of underlies some of the work that I do when I look at migration and family life. So again, kind of just throwing it out there so you know where my thinking comes from when I look at this. So now close your ears if you're a traditionalist in psychology, because this is an area, this is the methods that I actually use, not all the time, but I use it in these three studies that I'll talk about. And this is the indigenous Filipino psychology. So again, hardcore experimentalists, psych testing, etc. Cover your ears because this does not follow that. So this is actually a field that I actually was very resistant. I was like, oh my God, that sounds so unscientific. When I was an undergrad, I was like, that sounds crazy, not rigorous, etc. And then actually when I started doing the research, I thought, yeah, we're not going to get the quality data if we're doing our typical testing methods, etc. And then I started to study this. I went back to this field and I thought, yeah, there is something to it if we want to get, we'll talk about like validity, right? So yeah, you know, the reliability, etc. But there are ways, kind of just qualitative field methods. I have gone back to this, and I don't always use this, but for the studies I'll talk about, these are in the Philippines, I do use these methods. So first of all, basically it's rooted in culturally responsive, culturally appropriate practices. Methods are not translated for use with this population. So we don't use, psych testing, let's translate that measure for Filipinos, but no, these measures actually come from the society that you're studying. So they're sensitive to local norms. Methods here would be things like pagbibisita, which is sort of visiting by staying, pagtatanong-tanong, asking around. And I don't have time to go deep into these, but I think it's really important to look at data collection methods from the societies that you are actually studying, because sometimes there are more valid ways of collecting these data. There's also equal status. This is a big one in Philippine society where it's a very hierarchical society. equal status between researcher and participant is extremely important. So you have to work on developing those rapport and so on. And then it's also this is particularly relevant to Philippine context, where there's a rich history of colonialism reflected in our education system, and also the research methods that have been used traditionally by Western researchers in Philippine society. Okay, so I will jump into the first study now, right? And let me know, by the way, if there's questions in the chat that I need to address. Just let me know. So number one, so again, not going to go into detail, but I actually feel like I'm going to be just telling a story here of how I ended up with the studies I'm doing. So the first one here is the I call it Return to Tarong, a 50-year follow-up study on socialization and family life in a Philippine barrio. So what is this? So first of all, like I said, the Whiting's research way back in the 50s, started in the 50s. This was the first large-scale mixed method study on cultural socialization. So that pair of researchers, John and Beatrice Whiting and their collaborators, they got a grant, I think something like $100,000 from the Ford Foundation way back, to study socialization in 6 countries: the Philippines, Mexico, India, Japan, United States, and Kenya. And then they sent pairs of researchers, husband-wife pairs actually, to these countries to live for a year and collect data. So they did everything from qualitative interviews, the TEP test, psychological stuff, surveys, and a lot of field observations. So lots of books came out of it. My personal favorite is this one, 6 Cultures, Studies of Child Rearing, because that's the ethnography, where they're sort of these in-depth descriptions of the societies. And it's just fascinating, really, really fascinating. And by the way, these data are archived. All of this data is actually available for you to use. You can go over to, one is in Harvard. I mean, one copy is in Harvard at the Henry Murray Research Center. And the other one is in Connecticut, in Yale, at the Human Relations Area Files. So you can go there and get copies of these and reanalyze the data. Anyway, fascinating stuff. By the way, this book, The Children of Different Worlds by Carolyn Edwards and B. Whiting, that's the one that I stumbled into when I was an undergrad, that I thought I need to do this research. And so when I got to grad school, I started working with Carolyn Edwards, and I still remember the day that I came and visited her, and she handed me a dusty box of behavioral observations, and she says, "Here, do something with it." And so that was my very first project in grad school. I had reanalyzed the data from Kenya, and it took forever. I recoded. I was like, these handwritten observations of these researchers watching children. But it was fascinating, and you felt like you were watching these kids for an entire year, basically, and these 5-minute observations of these children. And then we recoded them for pro-social behaviors. Same thing I did for the Philippine and US data to look at pro-social behaviors too. And same thing, you know, after you work on these boxes of dusty data, of observations of these field workers, you feel like you know the children, because there's about 20-some children observed throughout the year. And it's just the most fascinating thing. And again, qualitative data, coding them for pro-social behaviors, coding them for the various variables I was looking at. Really, really fascinating stuff. And really amusing too, because then it was like you see them. There were some, I still remember to this day, for this one, where it would be, to say something like, 2 o'clock to 2:05, 2:05, 2:05 to 2:07. And then there's a big blank. And then the researcher says, "Those children stole my pencil and started throwing rocks at me." So I had to hide. And so it was just, I just had a lot of fun coding this kind of data. And by the way, when I was in grad school, there wasn't a whole lot of training within psychology. I mean, Maria knows, qualitative data, good Lord, why that was not in our, I had to actually go, when I said I wanted to do some of this qualitative work, they said, well, go across there was a kind of a footbridge between us and the next building where anthropology was. And they were like, go over there, take a class over there. So I did, and I actually did learn some of these methods from that our neighboring department. So where do I come in here? I graduated from grad school, and I was still very fascinated by the Philippine data. So this data was collected in the 50s. Like I said, I felt like I got to know these children looking at the observations throughout the year, for an entire year. And I said, I want to go back. I want to see what's happened to this village. I want to see what's happened to pro-social socialization, obedience training, and so on. Because actually the Philippines came out as one of the cultures with one of, I think they were second highest in terms of pro-social behaviors. Very high on discipline training, etc. High responsibility. So you see these kids, they're in the field, etc. So I wanted to see what happened to these kids. Is not so much the kids, but do they still socialize children the same way? High level of responsibility, and so on. And so I went back in 2006 and 2007 to collect data. We had to do a lot of investigating because they changed the name in the book. And then they had these, but then I had these maps, like written maps about then of course it had changed. We had to do some investigating to find out which village it was. And we did. And I went back, collected interviews. I wasn't able to do field observation, but I was able to do intensive interviews. I actually found about 6 of the original children. It was just amazing. It was, again, I felt like I know you because I was looking at your observations, detailed observations for a year. And then to have met them. And in fact, this was one of the brothers of one of the kids. And so some of the things I found, and again, this is qualitative, and then I'm not going to go into how we coded it. I mean, there was system. I mean, if you ever take qualitative or if you've taken qualitative research, there are systematic ways of coding, etc. Right? And one of I'm not going to go into detail, but the key findings was that, or one of the key findings was that there was stability in expectations and demands for children. So they still had this very high demand for responsibility, economic and household maintenance, responsibility, and still very similar notions around disciplinary practices. So anyway, so some of the findings was like a lot of the stuff changed, but these parents' notions, caregivers' notions, again, going back to that model, caregiver psychology was somewhat unchanged, actually, despite the shifts in the context. However, one of the unexpected findings, one of the unexpected things that actually led to my current research was this, and this was a total surprise, that there was tremendous restructuring of family and community because of migration. So, for example, a lot of the families that I met with there were skip generation families. So I don't know if you've come across this term, but it's this idea that the parent doesn't take care of the child. The parent it skips a generation. So usually the parent is abroad or in the city, and it's the grandparent who takes care of the child. So it kind of care skips a generation. And then when that child grows up, that child goes abroad, and then their parent, who never parented them, now parents their kids. It kind of skips a generation. It's now become this phenomenon. And it was very sad, to be honest. Like, I talked to some of these kids. And I met one, for example, who was one of the original kids in the study. So she says, she's there taking care of her grandkids. And she said, and this is common, most of them would say this, like, they were very resentful that their parents were not there for them. They were, in the city or abroad, and they promised they would never do this to their kids because they hated being away from their parents, not knowing them, being cared for by the grandparents. And they said 20 years later, they did the same thing. So then it was just this poverty there that led to this skip generation families. Mediated care. So the parents who were away, care came in the form of telephone, internet, remittances, gifts. You can actually go house to house there, and you can figure out who has a parent abroad. Like they'll have teddy bears and all sorts of big radios, things that where you could see that this was the way they were showing care. It also showed this increased economic disparities. I'll give you let me see if I can show this. I still remember that this conversation here in the lower right. I still remember this conversation that we were having, and because this village sort of sits on top of a hill. Well, here you can see it, right? And in some places you can look below. And I remember this woman telling me, you can look down and I'll tell you who has a overseas worker. The ones with a metal roof, those houses with a metal roof, they have an overseas worker. If it's still a thatch roof, like the grass, kind of dried grass, they don't have an overseas worker. So they said it was really changing the society. So this village that was depicted in the 1950s book had shifted tremendously because of because of migration. And then of course, shifting of caregiving responsibilities and who cares for whom. So anyway, so this experience and this unexpected finding kind of shifted my research completely. And I said, this is what I want to study. This is a huge phenomenon that's happening. The Philippines has one of the highest rates of migration worldwide. What's happening to families became my more recent, I would say the last 10 years, the focus of my work. So I'll just quickly describe two studies that I recently completed. One is this study that looks at the phenomenon of yayas. So in the Philippines, yayas mean domestic care workers. So they're kind of like nannies, but usually they live in the house, they live in your home 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, although technically it's supposed to be 6 days. They're supposed to have 1 day off, but that's not always the case. And I specifically focused on those who are parenting from afar while caring for children, other people's children. So I thought this was really interesting because although there's lots of immigrants, parenting from afar is hard enough as it is. But I was really interested in this phenomenon of what happens when then you're away from your kid, but you're also caring for somebody else's kid, really. So there are some scholars who study this. Rachel Pareñas, actually from California, studies this. She calls it the care chain, global care chain, because it's usually, like let's just say me, if I'm in the Western world or global North, I go to work. So I need to hire somebody to care for my child. That nanny probably left their child there. Somebody else is caring for it. So it's sort of this care, kind of like that skip generation. Nobody is caring for their own kid. It's almost like this care chain that's been happening. Domestic workers in the Philippines, actually worldwide, have been described as essential but invisible. They are an essential part of the economy worldwide, right? They allow for individuals to go back to work, usually in positions considered higher than what they're taking, especially relevant for women who can go back to work because other women are able to care for their children. I mean, it is a gendered phenomenon. I mean, not to say that it should only happen to women, but we know the numbers. This tends to be a gendered phenomenon. It's an important source of job, mostly by women. About 100 million jobs worldwide or 100 million. And I probably need to update this. Is from 2013. And then there's very few protections. It's hard to monitor because many of these jobs don't even have formal contracts. And frankly, a lot of the women, especially in the Philippines, who take jobs as yayas, have very few choices. So if, let's say, their employers are not giving them the minimum wage, well, they can complain, and there's actually 20, 30, 50 more women who'll take that job for less than what they're asking. I can't remember now why I said paternalistic relations. I'm sure some other scholar had used that term. But basically, it's also this informal kind of, you're part of the family, you're not quite part of the family, which brings in some benefits, but it also kind of gives you less control of your time. So for example, some women said, they know they can take the job, the weekend off, but they felt like they owed it to the family because they've given them so much. So yes, even if it's their kid's birthday, I'll stay an extra day, something like that. So what did we find? Again, using the same methodology I described earlier. And so this is really more of an intensive study rather than not volume, but in-depth, because I was really specific around women in a specific gated community in the Philippines. I wanted to keep it in the same community. 14 women, each of whom were separated from their own children, but were also working as a yaya. And this was considered high, kind of an expensive community. And the monthly salary was $71 to $113 per month. So you can see it's not a whole lot, not a big salary, right? So what did we find? I'll just highlight some themes that emerged from the data after we coded these. And these were like hours and hours of interviews, because this involved kind of hanging out at the park, hanging out with the women. We would chat and so on. And actually, a lot of them were just so I was amazed how they gave me their time. They would introduce me to other people and so on. And then they would come and send me, they found out where I lived or where I stayed in that village, in the community. And I would get these gifts from them. I mean, I was like, well, you're the ones who did me a favor. Why? Or you mentioned that your husband likes dried mangoes, and so they would pool their money and give me these dried mangoes. And I was like, well, I don't get it. Why are you, I'm kind of indebted to you. And they were like, nobody ever asked us these stories. Nobody ever asked us. It was so it was just the fact that somebody paid attention to their stories. I mean, it was just, actually, I have to admit, the first time I presented this data, I could barely get through it. It was just kind of remembering their stories and just the gratitude I had for these amazing women. So what are some of the themes that came out? One is this rural to urban migration was really in response to extreme rural poverty, really, really extreme. Not just that they, couldn't make ends meet, it was extreme poverty. And I'll just give some quotes here. So one said, life is hard in the provinces. We were just farmers. That was it. Oh, sorry. Oops. I was trying to move that the Zoom photo out of the way. And here we go. They said, we were just farmers. We could plant only when it rained. So this was a 19-year-old who had her 1-year-old son in a province. So here, just to note, 80% of poor people and considered poor in that, I can't remember now the exact peso figure, but poverty rates in Philippines is very, so to be in that poverty rate is really extreme poverty, especially by American standards. So 80% live in rural areas. For many, being a yaya in Manila is their only viable option. Another one is a clear theme. Long distance parenting has a high emotional toll. So here's one example. This is a woman actually who, oh my God, yeah, I could barely get through this interview. So here she says, when I left the hospital, my brother was already waiting outside. So after giving birth, and I had to hand him the baby. I rode the bus to Manila, because a job was already waiting for me. It was odd. I felt like I was floating the whole time, like my feet were not touching the ground. For a month, I didn't even realize I was crying while sweeping the floor, while eating, and so on. So this was like incredible. And she says it's they would describe it as near insanity, having to leave your kid, especially in the Philippines, where we have such gendered notions about parenting, the role of mothers. So this really contributed to a lot of that. Theme 3, this remaking of family was extremely important to these women. So a lot of them said, that they felt like they were mothers, but they didn't have anybody to give, like their mothering had to find a place, right? So they said, I'm a mother. Somebody has to accept this mothering that I have. I'm a member of a family. I have to have a family. So here's one example. So for example, they would use mediated communication to continue to connect with family. So across the distance. But also, so just as an example, right? I mean, for them, imagine that salary, the meager salary they had. To be honest, even if they did have, even if the employers gave them a week off, a lot of them couldn't really afford to go home anyway, because they would have a lot of, Philippines is made of islands, so they'd have to ride a ship or a boat. It would involve land transportation, water transportation, and certainly not airplane. You're not going to get anywhere on an airplane with that salary. So anyway, so then they said they couldn't reconnect with family away from who were away. They had then to do family where they were. So they would describe their alaga, their charge, the kid that they're taking care of, as a consolation prize. It's like, well, I can't have my child. It's horrible, but here, at least I have a consolation prize. Like, they lost the contest, but they have like a consolation prize. So here's one. This is also one of these really challenging stories. She says, the truth is, I can't imagine being separated from this child, from the child she's taking care of. My heart hurts. When I went on vacation, I missed him so much. So imagine you go to visit your daughter, and the whole time she says she's thinking about the child who she was taking care of, who she was paid to take care of. I miss him so much. I have deeper feelings for him than my own child. Maybe because I have taken care of him for so long. My own child, I didn't take care of her at all. I just gave birth to her. It's a difficult situation. So there's a lot of turmoil, guilt, and so on. Also, what was interesting is this sense of fictive kinships, that they were recreating family in the communities in which they were living. And again, I don't have time to, because I've written this up and I can always send that, but during this field work, for example, in one of the chapters that I wrote about this, I remember this, I talked about this morning ritual that a lot of the yayas in that one community have, where they get together in front of the preschool that a lot of the kids were going to, and they would get together, bring out their meals. There was a kind of like this school bus, and it's not exactly a school bus, but it is somewhat like a school bus. And the yayas would get in there with the school driver and some other people, and they would take out their plates and kind of like their lunches or their breakfasts, and they would have this breakfast together, kind of like a family. So they're kind of recreating family where they were. And they would even use kinship terms. So like kuya, which means older brother, ate, which means sister. So it was almost like they were recreating family where they were. And the family that they recreated also reflected sort of this Filipino society, Filipino family, like this hierarchical. They would find the father of that family, etc. So, and again, I've written up about this already, so I'm not going to go into detail, but it just gives you an idea of some of the work that we did in this area. So some key findings from this study. Number one, internal migration does not equal international migration. I think in migration research, we tend to lump migration research together. So sometimes, we don't differentiate between refugees and immigrants. That's huge. Internal and external migrants. So one example is Filipino migration. Internal migration for these yayas, $50 a month is their salary, much lower status than international migrants. International migration is also upending gender and family roles, because all of a sudden the women are the breadwinners. And yet there's also new power of people who are the gatekeepers, the people who are caring for their child. It's almost like their children are kind of hostage. They would say something like, if they want to talk to their child, sometimes it's like, well, the child is sick, so she doesn't feel well. I wish we had money to buy medicine. All right, so they'll send money. And then the next day, oh, here's your child, So anyway, so there's a lot of the implications for power dynamics in families is humongous. I already talked about the high emotional toll, and I talked about the remaking of family life. I don't have a whole lot of time to talk about this last study, but really this one now looks at the families in the US that we're now studying. And the reason we're doing this, so actually it's part of a bigger study. We're actually studying 5 Asian American populations: Filipinos, Korean, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Indian. So the 5 highest Asian populations. And we're looking at them in different contexts. I'll just focusing quickly on the Filipino population. looking at them in both high density and low density co-ethnics. So what we're trying to look at here is whether there is a difference. Let's say if I'm Filipino growing up in Nebraska versus a Filipino raising a Filipino child in Daly City in California, where every other person is Filipino. Same thing with any other culture, right? I mean, the context that you're socializing your child may have a difference, and that's what we're trying to find out. But anyway, I'll skip to some key findings here. Is that one is with these Filipino parents across these settings, they still in many ways socialize their children with values that were still very much quote unquote Filipino. So I'm not going to go into these, but they would say, like respect, they would expect big thing about respect based on age. For example, the use of kinship terms, not talking back to parents. It says so still kind of like this old school notion, not that I say old school, but traditional notions of what they consider, what the participants referred to as Filipino values. Emphasis on obedience. Like when I say clean your room, I better not see anything on the floor, and they do it. Second theme, that the parents really talked about practices that they grew up with, these natal practices, whether or not it was acceptable in their new context. If there were shifts, they were incremental shifts, very, very small shifts. I'll just talk about one here. Let's see. Oh, here's one. So they say, in the beginning, it was hard raising their kid. You would put him on timeout, like the quote unquote American ways that they said, take away toys if he doesn't listen. If it's still not being followed, you would spank him. And now I would just look at him and he is doing something bad. I don't know when it started, but now he knows. And this kid was only 5 years old, but they were saying, yeah, after they would talk about how they would try the American way, and then they would go back to these ways because they thought this was more effective. Oh, and here's another one that, again, was very it shows this notions of incremental shift, right? So they would say, I find myself, like when he's not wanting to go to sleep, I go ahead, I'm going to call the police. And he says, no, mommy, no police. Next thing I know, he's sleeping. And then it's actually a group of parents here. And they say, and then they laugh. But I don't want to say there's a wawak. Wawak is a ghost, which is a kind of a Filipino notion of how to get your kids to do things. If you don't do that, that wawak is going to, come and get you. And a lot of Filipino parents use, or some Filipino parents use really ghastly, like the manananggal, which is this half woman who flies into the night, finds naughty children, the tongue comes out and actually goes down the window and hits the belly button of a child who doesn't behave. I mean, some really ghastly. So actually these women were saying, there's a wawak there because I don't believe in wawak. So why am I going to instill that? Instill the fear, but something real, like the police. So a lot of them would talk about like how modern they've become. Like we're not going to talk about the wawak, but we use the police now because we're in America now. We gotta use the American kind of scary things, but not these old-fashioned ghosts and so on. So anyway, I don't really have the use of guilt. They would talk about how you don't listen to mom. What if mom dies? How are you going to feel about that? So really just a lot of these notions that don't change, but they would find ways to express them or hide them. And because there is that tension between what's acceptable and what they grew up with. Just at the end here, key points across 3 studies. In the context of migration, there is that inconsistency in those notions that I talked about. Many beliefs remain stable, and that's something that we found across all 3 studies. The consequence of inconsistency is tension between the new ways and what they kind of believed in, and so on. So I'm not gonna go into these, but anyways, that gives you a bit of an idea of some of the work that I do. A few things here. A lot of this work draws from other fields. Really important to look at other fields in your research. and kind of expand how we look at things, the questions we ask, but also how we conduct our research. So I kind of went over the 45 minutes there, but I can take a question or two, I guess.
Thank you so much. My family used El Cucuy and La Llorona.
Oh.
Those were the things that we were, and to this day, my sister and I talk about, do you ever get that weird feeling when you're dangling your feet over the bed and just wondering, remember the El Cucuy story? And I'm like, and to this day, I'm in my 40s and that still pops into my head. So yes, no, I think the fear thing is also common in other cultures.
Scare them. It's effective.
It is. I just thank you so much. And again, Cherry and I went to the same school. So I just want to say it was a really, for us, I think for her students, working with Carolyn Pope Edwards was such a privilege because her work and the Whiting's work was so important to developmental psychology that, to be in her presence was like, wow. And then I got to get some training in qualitative work. And so the other big person that was at UNL was John Cresswell, who was a big person in qualitative, but that was a little later. So I think Cherry and I were very lucky in who we got to work with and who we got to learn from, because wow, we had some impressive humans to work with.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually Carolyn, her initial training was anthropology. Mm-hmm. And then I think John Cresswell was in education. So I think when you go to grad school, or if you go to, I think we talked about that last time. A lot of the folks here are thinking about grad school, or you already are in grad school, but looking to these other departments, neighboring departments, that we're not just sort of narrowly looking at what's in our field.
Yeah, we were encouraged to be very interdisciplinary.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm going to open it up to questions. You could either direct message them to Edgar. Is there anybody else who they're supposed to direct message them to?
Brian or Andy.
Or you can put it in the chat, or you can ask them yourself. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, chupacabra was also used.
What's that?
Someone put in the chat that El Chupacabra was also used.
Oh yeah, let me see that. Yeah, we need to write a book about socialization practices and ghosts or something.
Socialization practice. Fear is your friend.
Yeah. Fear and guilt.
Fear and guilt, right?
The Filipino moms tools.
I have a question. Just because I do cultural research, but I don't do cross-cultural, I do more multicultural work. And we talk a lot about the mental health aspect, and you mentioned it, but do they talk about their mental health? Because I know that some groups somaticize it. Do they talk about it in the way that we talk about it in Western cultures, or is it more that sort of physical reflection of their mental health? Because some of that seems really intense.
Yeah, it's very intense. I think that these days there's increasing attention towards kids of migrants because of I can imagine 1 out of 3 kids has one parent abroad or both, right? So people are starting to, and this was, it started in the 70s, but it's really with a really poor economy continuing. People are now our biggest export, they said, so really huge implications for kids. So more and more there are these mental health experts that are starting to focus on these kids left behind, the left behind kids. For the ones who actually leave, so Filipinos, we talk a lot about resilience, like the psychological resilience, and there was, at least for the usually for the adults who are abroad, there's sometimes still a bit of a taboo about looking for mental health help. A lot of folks rely on, I don't know if it's almost like what's natural, I guess, which is more of church, going to church, looking to religion, but also that kind of social support. Filipinos everybody says, oh, Filipinos are always so positive because they joke a lot about stuff, even the ghastly humor. They make fun of their situations, but yeah, they did talk about mental health, like especially the yayas were saying sometimes the grief is almost like near insanity, because having that child is a constant, caring for a child, sometimes it's a daily reminder of something that they gave up. So it's hard enough when you're away, but here's a constant reminder of a child, so very much they talked about it a lot, but there's not a whole lot, at least at that time, not a whole lot of formal support necessarily. So there's a question about background, if my background had influence. I definitely think so, because, I speak the language. I kind of look like the women I'm interviewing. On the other hand, I also think that in some ways it was also hard because Philippines is a very hierarchical society, especially when it comes to class. It doesn't matter if I go there in rags, people kind of, almost like people can look at you and say you're educated. And there's already kind of that gap there. So I really worked a lot. It has still, even though I'm Filipino like them, parents like them, for either the US or the Philippines study, I had to work a lot on rapport. I started building rapport. And a lot of time, this is where the indigenous psych part came in, where you have to have that equal status. If you look at the transcripts of these conversations, I was being interviewed half the time that they were interviewing me, which to me, it's like, yeah, I'm asking you questions. Why shouldn't you be able to ask me questions, right? Sometimes very personal questions. They were asking me the same things. So there was that kind of importance of rapport building, even if we had the same cultural background. Benefits to skip generation parenting, that's a great question. I think the one, if there was, it's still tough. They would probably not having skip generation would be better than skip generation. But I would say if there was one benefit that I saw, at least in the Tarong study, so because usually kind of across in the research, right, usually separation from parents leads to a lot of negative things, poorer grades, etc. But what was surprising, and not just here, but in some of the other research out there on Filipino left behind kids, is that in some ways, like their grades are better in some situations, etc. And the reason is, or one potential reason that scholars have kind of guessed, is that when you're being cared for by somebody other than your parents, the expectation is to behave even better. You know what I mean? It's almost like, let's say if I'm like, Maria, I'm going to be out of town next week. Can you take care of my son? I would probably tell my son, you better behave. Do not embarrass me in Maria's house. Help with the chores, mow the lawn. Don't wait for her to ask you to help. You go and help. Right? It's almost that sort of higher this embarrassment that, well, we are very thankful that that my mother is taking care of you. So you better behave. And so in many ways, that was that. The other thing is that sometimes when the mother specifically, at least in the Yaya's study, when the mother is gone, who should take care of that child? So you would think, well, the father, right? The father would take care of the child. But no, it's usually because of these gendered notions of care over there. It's usually an unmarried aunt moves into the house, the grandmother moves into the house, or the child moves to the grandparents' house. And then the father kind of still takes care of the child, borrows the child. They would use those terms. My husband would borrow the child for a meal. So actually what happens with some of the skip generation families is that in the past, it's just the mother and the father taking care of the child. And now it's the grandmother, the father, the unmarried brother who still lives with the parents, the aunt, the other. So it's almost like in some situations, you now have multiple people taking care of this child rather than just the mother and father. So there's more eyes on the child, more attention, etc. Sometimes, it's not always the case. But if there was one benefit, at least I saw that in the Tarong and in the Yaya study.
I have another one. Because me and the adolescents. have you ever thought about going back and interviewing the adolescents and seeing their experiences and if they perceive benefits, or if what their perception is of this? Like, I know that we've done interviews with Latinx kids, and some of the comments are like, I know my parent has to do this. I know, and so their perception of what's going on is a little different.
Mm-hmm. I haven't, but there are scholars who have, like Rosal Pareñas has gone and interviewed the kids, when they grew up. And I think, if I remember correctly, her research shows like still a lot of resentment and so on once they grow up, which reflects what the kids in Tarong, who are already grown, like these were now grandparents. They were grandparents now, taking care of their grandkids, but they were taken care of by somebody else, or their grandparents. And they would say, yeah, we were resentful growing up. And they would say, growing up, I told myself I would never do this to my child. And then I became an adult and I did it to my child. So yeah, at least I did not hear, from Tarong and from the Yaya study, at least the adults remembering how they were when they were younger were very resentful. Because by now it's been multiple generations, like sometimes three or four generations of skipped generations. Is that a common one too in the research you're doing, Maria? You mentioned the Latinx.
No, so I've stepped away from that a little bit. I did a lot of that with Lisa Crockett, who's another great person. We did a lot of the interviews with Latinx families there when we talked about, their experiences with their parents and what that meant. And so it was kind of different because we looked at Mexicans, Cubans, and Puerto Ricans.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And the perceptions of those relationships were slightly different across all three groups.
Oh, you mean more of the parenting? So the parenting.
Yeah. So we asked those children to talk about, like, how do you know your parent loves you?
Okay.
And so, like, for one group, it was like they have rules and they enforce those rules. For another group, it was I know this parent loves me because it's the one that stuck around. Right. And so that's why I asked this question, because for that group, it was like, that's how I know they care about me. They stayed. So the skip generation is interesting because it seems like they're doing it for the benefit of the family, but then the family itself doesn't see that benefit because
very much
they feeling abandoned.
Yeah.
Well, we're at 5, so I just want to say thank you. Are there any other questions? I don't want to take too much of your time.
Yeah, I actually had a quick question. When you were contacting the people in the Philippines, how did you have to talk to somebody to connect you with the people? Were they reluctant to kind of talk to you as a researcher coming from like the United States?
Yeah, so the Yaya study. So first, actually, the Tarong study, they were so excited. They were like, there's somebody in our village from the outside. They were super excited. In fact, one of the pictures there, it was a school principal who actually closed. She was like, I'm closing my office. I'm going to go with you guys, and just went around with us. They were so excited. And in fact, one of the interesting things too, because, when I came back to the US, Carolyn Edwards said, when you go back, ask them what they thought of the original researchers, like these Americans who stayed there for a year, and so the people in the village says, oh yeah, we remember they were Corinne Neidiger and Bill Neidiger. They said, so these kids, right? They said, oh, our parents all thought they were CIA because they were like, what were these white people doing in our village? They were taking photos and taking notes all the time. They must have been CIA. So they were just excited to talk to me and ask about the Neidigers, whatever happened to their kids. And then in the Yaya study, first, sometimes there was reluctance because they were like, why are you asking questions and so on. I think the one thing that changed was when I kind of got the trust of someone, and then that kind of the snowball, right? So they were like, yeah, she's great. She'll listen to our story. Tell them about this. And then it kind of grew from there. But yeah, it took a while. It was one of these where it's hard to do this field research. You don't know, especially if you're doing some other work. You're like, am I going to be there for a day, 3 days, 5 days? Am I going to be able to interview? It's just very, very unpredictable. Same thing, I'm actually doing similar work in Poland where they have a growing Filipino population. super unpredictable because yeah, you might gain their trust in a day, but sometimes it'll take a week or 3 more meetings and so on. So kind of messy, very messy research compared to a lab, I guess. So great question. Could one reason manage? Oh, good point. Could be, I guess. I didn't specify. So the question in the chat is, could one reason behind children behaving better with caregivers beside their biological parents be that they thought that behaving would lead their parents to coming back? Could be. I didn't ask that specifically, but you know, especially for little kids, right? They come up with these theories in their head. I mean, who knows? Who knows? I mean, sometimes, yeah, kids try to make sense of things. And I wouldn't be surprised if at least some kids thought that. Thank you, Paula.
Are there any more questions for Dr. de Guzman?
Great questions.
If not, this concludes our event. Thank you, Dr. de Guzman, for coming and talking about your research. We really appreciate it. And for those of you watching the recording, thank you.